Good afternoon, and grateful for you to join us. My name is Brian Medina. My pronouns are Z, here, and heres, and I'm the Program Manager of Bias Incident Support Services here at the University of Maryland, College Park. We're welcoming you to this space and grateful for you to be here. I'm also on the unceded ancestral homelands of the Piscataway Conoy, which you should have seen on our slides. We'll do a land acknowledgement momentarily. I do want to, as you welcome into this space, to know that our chat is available for you to engage with one another, that if you have any questions for our panelists throughout the session, we'll be monitoring our Q&A, so please click on that box for any questions. And also, we welcome you, anybody who needs accessibility to use live captioning, to just click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. Grateful for you to be here. Nicole.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Nicole Garcia Diaz, and I use she, her pronouns, and I work in the Office of Student Conduct as coordinator for non-academic misconduct. And so I will be starting us off with a land acknowledgement. So if you can all join me in reflecting on these words. Every community owes its existence and strength to the generations before them around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy into making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to migrate from their homes in hope of a better life. And some have lived on this land for more generations that can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical in building mutual respect and connections across all barriers and heritage and difference. We believe it is important to create dialogue to honor those that have been historically and systemically disenfranchised. So we acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who were among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We are on indigenous land that was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. We pay respect to the Piscataway elders and ancestors. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. Alex just graciously put in the chat, depending on where you're joining us from, you can look up where the lands you're located correspond with and which Native American and First People were part of that land. So please feel free to take a look at that, and also for more information about the Piscataway Konai tribe. And so that's in the chat for you all.
Thank you, Nicole. And now for our esteemed and wonderful panelists. So I'm going to invite them here in a moment to introduce themselves, to share a bit about them, their pronouns, some of their involvements they've been on campus, and really anything that they'd like to grace us with their experiences. Before I do, I just want to acknowledge and appreciate each of them being in this space. It's wonderful to be in space with such wonderful humans who have done so much work as students and now going on into the workaday world for our world to heal after so much harm, especially over the last couple of years. So again, grateful for each of you. And I invite Nabila, if you could share with us first and invite.
Hi, all. My name is Nabila Prasetiawan. I use she, her pronouns, and I am currently a senior at the University of Maryland. So a little bit of background about my activism on campus. I've been involved in a lot of different student organizations such as the Student Government Association, student entertainment events, and really involved with the Asian American community. I'm doing a lot of advocacy, especially related to gender and sexual violence.
Thank you. Lucy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Lucy. I use she, her pronouns, and I graduated from UMD in 2020. I was a theater major. And when I was at UMD, I joined a sorority and had a really tough experience. I would say traumatic experience in the sorority. And I always felt like very alienated after the experience. And like I had lost my power in the situation and I didn't know how to go about it. But in my senior year, I released a podcast called Snapped, which is where I detailed my experience and felt like that was my way of taking control of the situation.
Thank you. Lizzie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Lizzie, she, her pronouns. I graduated in May of 2021, so this past May. And most notably, I was president of PSA for 3 years, president and vice president. PSA is Preventing Sexual Assault, an organization by students for students related to power-based violence. And currently, I'm on month 3 of a 3-month road trip. But when I get home, I am going to be doing consulting work for nonprofits.
Thank you, one and all. And throughout this time, Nicole will start us off with some formal questions, but I do want to invite you, if folks want to engage within the Q&A, within the chat, we have 3 very esteemed panelists to be able to share their lived experiences, encouraging them, of course, to share what they feel comfortable sharing. And at the same time, I honor that as you as guests, as audience members, there may be material here that could be very triggering for you. So I encourage you, as you end this space or even during this space, to take care of yourself, whether that's taking some time aside, using the restroom, getting something to drink, and then afterwards, whatever care is good for you, making sure that that's a part of the routine as a part of this work that we do together. So again, grateful for you in this space.
Absolutely. And I'll ask that Alex reshare the resources that we have available to everyone who's with us in this virtual space. So to start us off, I would love it if each of you could tell us a little bit more about your stories. I know you shared a little bit in the introduction and how you've used free speech and expression to navigate your time at UMD and beyond. So maybe Nabila, if you could start us off.
Yeah, sure. I guess my journey through student activism really came from entertainment and event planning. Something that I really like to do, to kind of bridge, or something that I like to say that I do is really bridge like societal change and policy change with a culture shift. And so that's a lot of like events and then creating the necessary noise to kind of, make the changes on campus or in the world. So something I've been really proud of being able to do with CE, which is student entertainment events. Like I was the lecturer's director. Usually we have people like Josh Peck, usually we have people like Ali Lacy, and we have like these really, really big like celebrities and stars on campus. But when I got into my role, I recognized the need for bigger conversations and harder conversations than we've ever had before. And so for me, that was uplifting Black and Indigenous women and kind of having those hard conversations on race and justice, equity, and inclusion. I think one of my favorite events and conversations that I had was with Toronto Burke. And she was, founder of the Me Too movement, and just like speaking on, what is the connection between race and assault? Like, how can we in college campuses create a more equitable justice system? Obviously, that event came a little bit too late because right now we're having so many issues and there's a lot of damaging statements that have been made by administration about, what the culture is at UMD. And so, I hope that those conversations and those events really try to like shift the perspective of like, it shows that like students care about this, like this many people came. And so I think one other notable thing is so I'm part of like the Asian American community. I think in the spring, in April, I was able to speak at the Atlanta Spa Shooting Vigil. And that's really where I spoke about my experiences on, my lived experiences as an Asian American woman, the fetishization, and the everyday violence that I feel, and just like how it's so much harder for people with like marginalized identities to get the support and help they need. And safety is not only like a physical one, it's emotional. And so that's kind of how I use my free speech and expression. I think that through college, I've been really able to like hone in on my storytelling. But I know it's like a hard journey that every individual has to go through as well.
I so appreciate you sharing that. And I think it's so important to even hear you mention that, you came into a role and saw the status quo and took that as an opportunity to help those around you and to do that education and shift the conversation, which, as you're talking about storytelling and understanding your own journey takes energy and courage. So thank you. That's so appreciated. Lucy, would you like to share with us next a little bit more about your story and how you used your speech on campus?
Yeah, so as I talked about a bit earlier, I used my speech to take my power back and find some control in a series of unfortunate events that I felt like I had no control over. But I also think that I used it to start a conversation and have impact on the Abolish Greek Life movement. I know that when I released my podcast, I had like a flood of messages of other people sharing their difficult experiences within that system. And I think in that system, in any system, there can be a lot of shame in being failed by that system. And oftentimes they can make you feel like it was your fault when in reality it wasn't. And so I think that through sharing my experience and being really vulnerable in that, it also allowed people to share their story. To maybe, like, for some people, I was the first person that they opened up to and said, hey, me too. That's the power behind Me Too. The more we talk about our experiences, the more other people will feel that they can do the same.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And I just want to absolutely validate that by you sharing your story, giving people the space that they need to feel heard and seen in what you shared, and then to feel comfortable or confident or safe enough to share that as well. And so kind of the ripple effects of that, those efforts. So thank you. And Lizzie, would you like to jump in and share us a little bit more about your story as well?
Yeah, I think I really echo what Nabila said about it's kind of hard to come into your own storytelling, like whatever that may look like. And for me, I guess it really started with myself and kind of voicing my frustrations in like 2017, before I was even a member of PSA, with Slut Walk and different events in PSA. And I think I finally came. And so as president of PSA, as just kind of having a following, like being a student at the University of Maryland, published a lot of letters aimed at the new Title IX regulations, aimed at administration, honestly, one even aimed at Greek life, that kind of told my story. And then it was validated. It's terrifying and validating, having people echo that. And then I think that the second, and it's really cool too, because that's how you get administration to notice you, is to kind of put your lived experiences out, as scary as that might be. And then I think the second half of my University of Maryland career was really spent helping others tell their stories. And a lot of that is PSA events that we have. And we do a lot of letter writing campaigns, and we do a lot of petitions, and just kind of utilizing University of Maryland students' free speech to, one, get things done, but also show them that they're not alone. I think that's like one of the most valuable things I took out of PSA, was there's a lot of people who need preventing sexual assault, and there's a lot of people who can learn from PSA. They just need to be brought into one space together.
Thank you so much. I think in each of your stories, and Lizzie, what you were just highlighting of truly the power of when you speak that truth is that it demands to be noticed, and that is really something that I think maybe when I was an undergrad, I don't think I realized that power. So to see you all doing this and having, these moments is really inspiring to me. And so I greatly appreciate all of that.
In adding to that, we'd love to hear from each of you how your power, you talk specifically about empowering your voices, but also how your identities have maybe shaped when and how you speak to audiences, to friends, to administrators. How do those identities show up for you through these conversations? And maybe Lucy, could you start us off with this one?
Sure. I feel like my identity became a lot stronger because by the time that I had shared my story, I had really felt strong in everything that I was saying, and to be able to see backlash eventually, and to have people talking about it, and some people picking the story apart, even though I did have moments where I was sad and oh my God, people are being mean on the internet. Overall, when I fell asleep at night, I just felt a certain confidence and yeah, okay, people are responding to this, but that's their freedom of speech. I told my truth and my experience. They can do that as well. And everyone also being able to then look at it in the way that everyone has their own perspective. Everyone has grown up with a different story, and just feeling confident enough to say, this is my truth and it's a fact.
Thank you, Lucy. So much of what you're sharing, harkens for me the difficulty, the struggle of being able to name what it is that you experience, that your identities are, and that how the backlash can be that much more forceful in recognizing that that power is in some ways addressing the power structures that are in terms of systems, in terms of people groups, that folks responded and turned to you, perhaps because they felt threatened or because they felt like their identities were called into question or their beliefs that they've held standing. So again, grateful for you, Lucy, to name how that has shown up for you. Lizzie, would you like to share a little bit more from what you've experienced in terms of how your identities intersect and power in this?
Yeah, sure. So when I joined PSA, it was only 2 years out of an organization, so very new. And now it's a lot bigger. There's over 100 members, and we do a lot bigger things. But the reason I mentioned that is PSA was started because a girl in a sorority realized that two members had, her and another member had been assaulted by the same person. And so it's very strongly built out of Greek life. I don't think PSA would exist if it wasn't for Greek life, the money they donated, the people that came to the events. And obviously grateful that we got to start. But because of that, PSA is very white, very straight, and very cisgender. And not as much as it was obviously when it started, but still majority, and still relies really heavily on Greek life. And I think there's some pros and cons. I think there's a lot to do with education within Greek life. However, the biggest thing that I was when I was president is that there's a huge responsibility to represent everyone. And there's a huge responsibility to make sure that the narrative is not the white sorority girl. Although sexual assault is common within Greek life, there's a lot to do. And I think the first 3 years of PSA was about survival. So by the time I came into my role, we were at a point where we could focus on what we were doing wrong, or what we weren't doing enough of. And intersectionality is the biggest thing. So I think for me, a lot of identity and free speech looks like stepping back and helping others tell their story. And that came into light a lot when my freshman year friend started Black Turks Matter, and PSA had the resources. We've done before, we knew how to host events, but it wasn't our role to take on anything, just show them how to do it and give them anything that we could possibly help them with, even if it's as simple as. And so I think that the biggest thing I had to take on as a white, straight president of PSA was making sure I was stepping back and not like speaking for others.
Thank you, Lizzie. And certainly, again, in working around sexual violence work, as you've described, I appreciate you naming, it has a long-standing history for services nationwide as well as more locally, as serving cis, white, straight women, and how expanding that resource and that voice and that amplification of their voices to be folks of color, trans folks, non-binary folks like myself, and grateful for you to recognize what it means to step back and to work alongside rather than on behalf of, as if some white savior complex is going to change the system, but really that working alongside your peers in Black Terps Matter may indeed create more of solidarity, more positive change than simply doing something on behalf of without any real acknowledgement of the pain that others might feel in different identities. I want to also, to Nabila, to share, you talked a little bit about being involved in ASU. How has that experience, or maybe other identities that show up for you, how has that impacted the way you use your voice too?
Yeah, so just a little bit about my background. So, yeah, I'm an Indonesian Muslim, and my parents are both immigrants. And so I think growing up, I've always realized that a lot of institutions do not support me, and I never understood why. Specifically schools, specifically the media, films. There's a lot of coded Islamophobia, coded racism that, it just growing up as like a woman of color, you acknowledge, and I think it really just like bogs me down. It makes you question, like, why can't I be like my other peers, or not understanding your position. And so I've been coming into the University of Maryland, being able to take a lot of woman, gender, and sexuality studies courses and Asian American studies courses has really helped me kind of find my power. Just because there's so much power in education and curriculum, especially knowing that there are people who came before you. There's people who struggled and fought for the right for you to be in school, the right for your curriculum, your history to be taught. And so that's why I really try to be rooted in academia, just because there's really great writers, Audre Lorde, Kimberly Crenshaw, who also really lead kind of my mindset and my perspective. But in terms of kind of my own identity, I think it's definitely much scarier to talk about your own experiences. There's much more vulnerability. And so, at least for me, aside from the academic part, and just understanding where I came from, it's really important to see for me who's beside me, who's part of my coalition, who's supporting me. Because that's kind of the most important thing. If you do not have any backup from a mentor, from a friend, it's 10 times harder. And to have a community to rely on, that's just been the best thing to find on campus.
Thank you, Nabila. To just name how, not just in the academic settings, that you felt affirmed and that you're able to kind of liberate some of the notions of history and herstory for yourself, but that through camaraderie, through relationships, through mentoring, that other folks can feed and support you. And I'm sure likewise, at least I can name for me, you likewise inspire a lot of this work in the staff members and the other folks that maybe you're in touch with. And so grateful for you sharing how not only the identities maybe shape your understanding of self, but how that can also coincide with affinity spaces and aggregating some sort of solidarity across the campus. Grateful.
One of the things I'm hearing, Nabila, you just mentioned, there is a level of vulnerability, and it can be scary to share some of these things, especially so publicly as you all have, in spaces where it can really have an impact. So I'm wondering, what is the price or the cost of that free speech to each of you? How did you make the decision to take that risk and to speak up? And really, anyone who wants to start off, I would love to hear from.
I can take this. This is like, I don't know. I think that there's a huge cost. I was actually kind of hesitant to do this panel because, so I graduated from UMD in May, and graduating was really hard for me because I loved the University of Maryland. I love public policy and women's studies, my two majors. I loved my friends, loved everything about my experience, except for the fact that the University of Maryland as an administration like made my 4 years hell. I remember telling my therapist, like if I didn't graduate soon, I didn't know if I could still do PSA. And it's like, I feel like I traded off a huge amount of my time, my energy, and my experience as a college student. Like, I guess to give you two examples, I went abroad my junior year in the fall, and specifically picked an abroad program where I couldn't have Wi-Fi because I just knew that the only way I was going to survive another 2 years was to stop for a few months. And now I'm on a 3-month. I wanted to do this as a career. I needed to take a step back from PSA and from UMD, especially. And so I think that it's really, really hard to do a job that you know your administration should be doing. And it's even harder to force relationships and resources onto employees that you pay. Like at the end of the day, I paid the Title IX office and Daryl Pines and everyone else in between. And so I think PSA being like the nature of it, that it's for policy changes and education, I had a really hard time screaming my lived experiences, other members' lived experiences into like what felt like a brick wall. So there is a huge cost. There's really no way to sugarcoat it.
Absolutely. And one thing I heard you say was doing this job that administration should have been doing. And I think just validating just that, it is a job, it's labor that all of this work is. And so deeply appreciating that. And I heard you mention even being unsure about, participating today. And I guess my follow-up question to you would be, what drives you to continue to speak even with that incredibly high cost?
I think it's twofold. Part of it, which I almost resent, is that I don't want anyone else to have to do this. And I already have the skills developed. I know that's not super self-care vibes of me. And the second part is I've thought about it a lot. And I don't think I would do anything differently of the last 4 years. PSA did a lot of really good things. I did a lot of really good things. It's not my shortcomings. It's like the administration shortcomings for not believing me or listening to me. So I think that's the biggest thing. Like even being on this panel, I was worried to do it and like to kind of bring back a lot of these memories, but I missed it. Like there's a reason I did it. I think that at the end of the day, it's a really hard fight, but it's not one worth giving up.
Thank you so much. Nabila or Lucy, would you like to answer that question of kind of that price of free speech and how you weighed that out?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned before, the word that really came to my mind is emotional labor. I think activism, especially when it's like so deeply rooted in your identity and your experiences, is exhausting. And ultimately, like we don't get paid for this. Sometimes we see very little results in the 4 years that we're here. You can get one thing changed, and then once you're gone, that's it. So I mean, I think there's a huge cost. But at least for me, kind of like the most important thing is that, like Lizzie, like no one else will go through the same experiences, or there'll be better experiences for the people who come after me. Like I think a lot about how I'm like the oldest of 4 siblings, and so I have like a typical caretaker vibe where I want to make sure that my siblings kind of have a better experience than I do in school system, in everything. And so, because the University of Maryland is my community and like those small pockets, like I want to make sure that they have a better, have a better experience than I do and feel more protected and safe. And kind of to talk about, the emotional labor, I want to kind of go towards like what self-care is, especially for activism. in the past year, I've had a lot of conversations with full-time activists, Toronto Burke and different sorts of people. And the one question that I always ask is how do you sustain this? How do you make time for yourself? Because it is so exhausting. I'm exhausted after the 3 years that I've been doing this. And so, just making sure that I have boundaries for myself and, little pieces of serotonin into every day. I like to watch the sunset. That's my thing. But I know if I want to make a sustainable, if I want to make a sustainable career, if this is what I'm really passionate about doing, I need to make sure that I'm fully supported by, everything around me and making sure that self-care is a priority.
I so appreciate what you said about thinking about those who will come after you. And I think it was beautifully paralleled with what you were talking about before in education, those who came before you. So thank you for saying that. And as we continue to have this conversation, this idea of, in order to continue this important work, how do you make it sustainable is crucial. So as all of you continue sharing, feel free to share maybe what those experiences have been like for you, because I think for everyone listening and for everyone who is engaged in this challenging work, that will be key for moving forward. So thank you, Nabila. Lucy, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, so for me, there was a lot of fear surrounding releasing my podcast. What everyone saw was the end result after two and a half years of thought and considering what's the best way to do this, what information do I include, am I gonna get sued, especially when you're talking about a big organization like a sorority who has a lot of money, who has lawyers on deck, and who has a lot of people, high power people behind them. And I'm just one individual. I'm a college student. I can't afford a lawyer. So and also I don't know anything about law either. So I'm just kind of had to navigate going into it, what am I allowed to say? And so one thing that I did was I went to the free legal aid on campus and I kind of told them my idea. And I was like, so is there a chance I can get sued? And they're like, yeah. You yeah. And I'm like, oh, no. And so I had to do some more research about defamation. Had never heard the word before. Now I've read lots of different articles about it. And I came to the conclusion that there is a lot of power in the truth. And you can't be sued for defamation when you're speaking the truth. And I also, one of my favorite quotes is, judge your battle by your allies. And the more allies that I found in my community and the way that my friends really supported the project and the way that even when I felt like I didn't want to continue working on the podcast, something in me would come around and be like, no, you've got to do this. I feel like in a certain way, I was my biggest ally as well. And yeah, I know that the people that I love and stood by the project, I really respect them, and all the different allies, I really respect their opinions. And so at the end of the day, I knew that while I was going up against a big organization with lots of money, I was judging my battle by my allies.
Lucy, thank you. I think that probably hits home to a lot of folks who are tuning in, because when you are saying hard things, the power dynamic, whether that be identity-based or a large organization, a university, a national group, it's something to consider, and it can be overwhelming. And I'm so glad you had that community of support and also checked in with resources that were available to you and were able to push through that and have that released. Thank you.
again, I echo what folks have shared and just pause and appreciate the amount of labor or the cost that you all just described, and even just the cost of being in space with us here and now. I just, again, want to name how important it is while also how difficult it is, and so grateful. Our next question is a little bit of a deviation, but I think in some ways ties, Lucy, to what you were sharing about that boldness of sharing in not just kind of a smaller community with oneself, but sharing it for the masses, sharing it in a podcast or sharing it through other online tools. I'd love to hear from each of you that are willing, but maybe start with Lucy about how did the factor of this coming out to hundreds, maybe thousands of people, how did that influence the activism and the free speech elements, and how that impacted even you in this process?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of the responses that I got validated everything that I was saying, whether they were negative responses saying like, oh, you joined a top tier sorority, like Greek life isn't for everyone, like kind of victim blaming, or responses of same, me too. I think that putting it online and putting it in a space that was very shareable and putting it in a space where people could directly direct message me and respond was very useful. And in the last episode, I brought up the idea of a season 2, and I put like a Survey Monkey link on the podcast's Instagram. And so that was another way that I used media to hear about other people's stories and then make an even bigger impact by now having a second season and giving a platform to speak about those stories that usually don't have a direct space for.
I was going to joke a little bit about, are we hearing an announcement here in this space, but really just acknowledging how much, going from, I'd imagine that you didn't anticipate a full season, let alone now season 2, and what that means to share deeper, and yet nonetheless, going back to the labor involved and the trauma that's involved, of talking about these things are that much more difficult. I can imagine that in a season 2, asking for other folks to maybe coincide and share their own stories, and even in your stories, the reflection about this process looks a little different. So again, grateful, Lucy, for you even walking us through what that would look like for a young activist new to the university, thinking about maybe doing their own podcast or some kind of sharing season. What would that look like for them? I appreciate you kind of talking through the mechanics of that alongside how that empowered you. Others, would you like to share?
Yeah, I can go. I think online tools was one of the most important things for PSA my senior year of COVID. I graduated in 2021, real bummer. So it all started in March of 2020 when COVID started and our Occupy McKeldin got canceled. The biggest stressor to myself and the old president was survivors are still out there. A lot of them are isolated, some with their assaulters. Like, what can we do? And so from then, I think PSA really went online. We did Occupy McKeldin online with a letter campaign. We did Denim Day online with an Instagram graphic campaign. We did infographics. PSA as a club moved online. I think we're one of the few organizations that grew during COVID just because we didn't slow down at all, because if anything, COVID made it a lot more dangerous for survivors because everything was online, especially within Greek life with parties going underground and things like that. And I guess one of the benefits I learned from that is online tools are really helpful. Having a virtual Occupy McKeldin made it so way more people could come, including my friends from home in Syracuse who just were interested. I know Lucy spoke and she was incredible. And then I think also it helps bring a lot of people in without them having to come to an event, either for personal reasons or just because they don't want to walk across campus. Infographics and things like that, and doing recaps of our meetings and everything online just makes it, one, more confidential if you want to check out PSA without anyone knowing, and two, for pure laziness, helps us reach a lot more people. And lastly, we got a lot more of the administrators' attention with media campaigns. And I think this year PSA is doing a great job combining media online and in person with Slut Walk and the chalking that they've been doing. But it's a lot easier to see how many people reshare a graphic than it is to see how many people like come to a private GBM meeting or something like that. So I think I can't speak highly enough about online tools. I wish we used them earlier.
Thank you, Lizzie. I mean, it's one of those things, at least as a staff member, and kind of going through what does it mean to use online tools. You know, we often think about this as a negative side, the negative ramifications of Zoom bombing or of social media that may target certain populations, but how much you can harness in a positive way and galvanize, from your case, PSA, and gain momentum and gain more attention and gain even possibility of folks that aren't even from the university to assist you in the process. And I really wanted to key into that confidential piece, that for a lot of folks, that barrier of entry, or maybe, you know, you said it's laziness. I think there's also accessibility present where folks may not be present to go 15, 20 minutes across campus to get to an event, but they can maybe participate in an online option and share, here's my story, and here's something that I'd like to assist in that may not look the same as a march, that they may not physically even be able to do. And so grateful that you're highlighting the pros of why social media, why these online outlets can exist for our use, how we can also turn that table of it always being used in the negative. So grateful, Lizzie. Nabila,
Yeah.
did you want, go ahead, Tilly,
Do
Nicole.
you mind if I jump in real
Sure,
quick?
please.
The other thing I think is interesting, we've talked a little bit about when you're speaking truth at the direction of large organizations, to be able to go online where you've got the reach of others, the reach of media that is also looking to see what's happening. All of a sudden, there is this dynamic of potentially a larger organization being like, now I do need to pay attention because everyone can see this. And so really utilizing that, even a small group of people who are being, you know, very intentional about how they're using these tools, it can be so impactful. So I'm glad to hear that the group grew even during such a tough past few years, and you all were able to support one another in that way too.
I can jump in. Yeah, I just really wanted to echo the accessibility piece of like the online atmosphere on Zoom and being socially distanced from everyone was really hard. But I think it allowed for, you know, organizations like PSA to thrive, and it allowed people to get more into activism and, you know, have people hear their voice a lot more. And so I think, you know, going forward, always like with my organization, just making sure that people have a way of entry to participate as much as they can. Like, you know, whether they may not be able to actually march, or whether they not be able to like drive to Annapolis, it's still important with the participation. And in terms of media, I think it's so important that we're able to use social media in our writing to control your own narrative. You know, because like I said before about kind of my identity, I'm always feeling like the narrative is always controlled for me in some way or another. And so kind of like slowly building up that power and that ability to share your own opinions, your story. It's like very, very vulnerable. And like, you know, I admire Lucy for putting out that podcast, because that, you know, takes a lot of strength. But you know, the aspect of being able to like reclaim your narrative and being able to, you know, like your words are out there and people can try to twist them, but it's all out there. It's like, it's amazing.
Thank you all so much. So I would love for us to kind of turn to thinking about, you know, I know you all either have had many years on campus or have since graduated and moved forward. But as you look back at your college experience, what would you encourage new students to do in order to empower and use their voice while they're at UMD? And maybe Lizzie, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, sure. I think number one, we talked about this a lot, is self-care. I wish I set a lot more boundaries and took a lot more time for myself. And like at the end of the day, you always have to put yourself first, no matter how hard that is. And the second thing, which is like the most important piece of advice I was ever given, was don't force relationships with people and administrators and organizations that don't want to have them. There's more than one way up a mountain, and there's a lot of administrators, faculty, staff, and other students who want to help and want to do the work. So I don't want to say you're wasting your time, but you're wasting your energy. And like for me, this was the big one with Office of Civil Rights and Sexual Misconduct. But at the end of the day, students have a lot more power than they're made to believe. And so offices need you as much as you need them. And so kind of giving yourself more confidence than like I ever had as a freshman.
Yes, I love that. There's more than one way up the mountain, like 100%. I even think about when I was starting off here as a new staff member, seeing some of these issues and genuinely just cold emailing my now partners over in bias incident response services. And so just thinking about how can we be strategic to do all these different steps. Thank you, Lizzie. Nabila.
Yeah, I guess I've said this before, but really try to find your coalition and your allies on campus. Community is so important. And so to find that in your first year, your second year, even your last year, I think that is like kind of the most empowering things you can find, and then being able to express that.
Thank you. And Nabila, if you don't mind me asking, in your experiences, what was your strategy in finding your coalition, if you feel comfortable sharing?
Yeah, I am the type of person to throw myself into everything almost. Like I remember my freshman year, I was like, I'm gonna go study abroad, I'm gonna do alternative breaks. And I think through that, I really found the people who were the most supportive and the most open. I found that like, you know, when I'm working on issues within the Asian American community, or with juvenile justice, or sexual assault prevention, that's where I could find, you know, my communities. So it's really like, you know, it's not always the first try. I think I've definitely been in spaces where, you know, I felt unsupported, or like people said I like pushed too much in ideas or changing too much of the status quo. And so like I think just being brave enough to like make the first introduction and being very like true to yourself, like, you know, you know, just echoing with me, like don't force relationships, because like the people who will be there for you will take you as a whole person and not like how you present yourself or how you think they want you to be.
That's so meaningful and such powerful advice. Thank you. Lucy.
I would say to challenge what you're seeing around you, even if it's being supported by the school. Just because the school is supporting it doesn't mean that it's ethical. So for example, Greek life, I also find that, well, I would encourage students to join organizations that are not Greek life, because oftentimes I've seen that students go in with amazing intention and like thinking that they can be the change. They have the work ethic and the dedication to reform the system. But then they're met with disappointment when they realize that they just spent hours and hours of unpaid labor putting an effort to a system that can't be reformed. And yeah, I think it's also oftentimes the people who are doing that unpaid labor are people of color, are the queer students, are the ones who have been sexually assaulted and have that drive behind it. And I find it really sad that, you know, the school is openly endorsing these communities that might simulate reform by doing things like, instead of calling them a pledge, you're now a new member. Instead of calling it hazing, it's now new member education, you know, doing these little things to make it like, oh, we're better. But in reality, it's all up at the national level, and at the national level, they will never let it be reformed. And yeah, I think it's sad to see. And so I would really encourage students, especially the ones that have that drive, to put that drive into another organization, and to also do research about the organizations that you join. I know before I joined Greek Life, I didn't do my research. You know, it's rooted in racism and sexism and all these things. And yeah, I think that the more information that we put out there, also the more likely people won't join.
Thank you so much.
Lucy, I just, a small commentary and appreciation for you naming, my work is all about addressing the very systems and the biases that happen across campus, on and off, online and in person, and agreeing with you that it is very difficult to go into space knowing that you could be exploited, that you could be tokenized, that you could be, harmed directly as a result of your engagement and your involvement. Each of you have shared how difficult it was for you throughout the years to be in part of whatever organizations. Even when it was liberating, it was also a lot of labor, a lot of heart that put into it. And so I guess, there's another question we want to get to about staff, but for you, Lucy, I wanted to hear, and maybe from each of you, what are some ways that, kind of looking on the flip side, how can we move from this performative nature of sticking a new label or putting representation, putting somebody on, an organizational chart that has, person of color, LGBT person, and how can we move from the performative toward a more transformative model where free speech and liberation is just a part of the angles and how we change structures, and folks are less intimidated about how that's dismantling. In fact, it's actually a part of the process. So again, performative to transformative is part of my question.
I would say by looking at the foundations of the systems, and not expecting for one diversity chair or one sexual assault liaison to make that change or be part of it, but especially when they're faced with a broken system that kind of puts it all back on them. So I would say, in terms of Greek life, figuring out ways to start from scratch and rebuilding it entirely, which would mean abolishing Greek life and figuring out ways how to give resources to the community, and tearing down the Greek houses and putting a community center, or figuring out ways to make it more of a student space that's inclusive for everyone, where you don't need to pay $1,000 each semester to be part of it. So I would say starting from the ground up and not the other way around.
Thank you, Lucy. Go ahead.
I think I have two things that came to mind. One is, so I agree with Lucy, some senses about Greek life, but while Greek life exists, there's a lot of work to do about sexual assault prevention within Greek life. And one of the most successful ways that PSA and I found is just giving them space for conversations. A lot of people didn't learn about consent and power dynamics and all this until college, and have a lot of questions and aren't really given the space to ask them. So that's kind of a temporary fix. And the biggest thing to me that I've learned is not pinning it on the students to do this. I think there's a lot of work that students can do and organizations can do. But the example that comes to mind is the Department of Fraternity and Sorority Life has a sexual assault liaison, as Lucy touched on, for every chapter, but it's only prevention and not response. And DFSL doesn't have anything for response, but it looks like they're doing enough for sexual assault because they have the prevention liaisons. And then they leave it up to every chapter. And I think that's just one example of Greek life. And I can give 15 more, like the Title IX Student Advisory Board that isn't actually listened to. I think that there is a lot of spaces where the university pins problem solving on students when one, it shouldn't be their job, and two, when the solutions are created, administration doesn't listen anymore. So I do think students have some work to do, but not all of the work.
Yeah, and just to echo Austin's birthday, I feel like, you know, kind of being in this space or working closely with the administration, they sometimes do just put like a student in a group just to be like, yes, students are involved. But there's such like a gap in information when, you know, I'm the only other student, maybe there's a grad student, and then the rest of the like the 6-7 people are faculty. The one thing I want to say is like, you know, you can give a seat to someone at the table, but if you're not actually listening, or if you're putting all that burden on them, it like does nothing. I've been in those positions when, you know, like I've been tokenized and like I feel like a lot of the diversity work does fall on me. And then at the same time, I'm not being listened to because, you know, it's a little too much of a change. It's like not how things are run in this organization. So that's really frustrating. So like, you know, I think I really do agree with like kind of starting over with stuff. I really, really don't like those like diversity positions or liaison positions because ultimately they're ineffective and actually don't give that person in a position any power.
One thing I heard from each of you is a lot of the work and the labor that is required and being asked is being put on the folks who are being marginalized or oppressed in the first place. And I think even acknowledging that every time you see it and naming that, or even asking for compensation, a lot of times these questions, when you say them out loud, and you've all kind of reflected this too, you're looked at as being radical, or Nabila, I know you just said, people tell you, well, that's not really how this is done, but how can we encourage folks to continue to note these things as just one small piece in this very complex system? But thank you all.
Just to echo, just the amount of work that is required in this, and yet the amount that the resources that the university and the system has, frankly, on the whole, to be able to reprioritize itself. And, you know, we're not a small campus. We're not a campus that doesn't have some means. And while there may be answers to our budget and struggles, you know, I appreciate the three of you really naming how this has affected you personally, how this has affected your peers, and how this is unacceptable. And just naming that in itself, folks need to, as audience members, folks afterwards in the recording, look at yourselves and say, how are you contributing to this tokenization, misrepresentation, put somebody on without any kind of power, putting, as Nabila was saying, if one student amongst 6 faculty or staff, how is that really going to change the dynamic and culture around that group? You know, the next question we wanted to ask is around faculty and staff. What are some of the tangible things, and some of you have already mentioned about dismantling, and so some of it may be tied into that, but what are some of the things that faculty and staff can do to be better advocates for activism across the board?
I have a lot to say on this topic, but I think that at the end of the day, student activists are raised up on this platform, they're hoisted up. Administration always says, we spoke with students, we spoke with students, we did this with students. And I don't ever feel listened to. I know Nabila just talked about this. And so it's more of, to me, listening, like it's everything Nabila just said, listening, I'm invited to speak. And the other thing is, I feel like I'm constantly trying to prove myself. Like I'll never forget, I met with Daryl Pines last year, and the first question he asked me is how I measure PSA success when I came to the meeting talking about my experiences as a student at the University of Maryland, like organization aside. So I don't think as myself with my accolades or my GPA or like how many members I have in my organization for an administrator to listen to me. And that's even if I get listened to by an administrator. I guess like the bare minimum is to get an email answered every once in a while, because I think it's a real slap in the face to activists that their time's worth more than ours when we're doing their job and students. And And the other thing is sorry, lost my train of thought. Like I said, I should be a student first, but I think that student organizations can sometimes pose a problem too. Like this has come from personal experience with PSA, which is such a new organization. I feel like I'm oftentimes trying to prove myself to the more established orgs who have more university support, like SGA or ODK. Like honestly, as the president of one of the biggest organizations on campus, it shouldn't take me until senior spring to get into ODK. I think that there's a lot of work to do. And I think that that goes like with the organizations, but also there's a lot of times where administration will invite SGA to the table and not PSA. And there's reasons for it. SGA gets their funding from the university. But it shouldn't be such a political game for me to try to save, I guess not save, but for me to try to elevate students at this campus who are being actively harmed.
Yeah, honestly, just want to echo what Lizzie says. I mean, as someone who's both part of, or who is part of SGA and ODK, there's a lot of institutional like politics at play, and it is really frustrating. Especially that was like my experience in SGA. Just like, okay, kind of back to the last question. Like, you know, I felt like I was there to kind of, you know, uplift and bring, you know, other people to the table and making sure they have a voice and they have the power, but always being stopped before doing so. And you know, and usually a lot of those organizations like can't speak for everyone, and they most of the time do not, which is actually really frustrating. So I think for me at least, back to the faculty and staff member question, I think that at least for me, the biggest thing was like mentorship. Someone who is able to tell me like, you know, like how can we get from this to this? Like telling me like who are the people they can connect me to. But also I really appreciated understanding like the faculty's perspective of the school as well. And I think that some people shy away from that. Some people are like, they listen to students, but they don't give any like feedback or like, yeah, this is wrong. Like, you know, COVID precautions are wrong. Like it, I think it's validating to understand that like, you know, students are the only ones struggling, but also there's struggles within each department and at each level. It's like it's not only the students fight. And I think if we're able to hear from people, from our professors, our advisors, that like, you know, there are deeply rooted issues, it makes us feel like, you know, we can actually tackle this together at different levels.
That very minimum level of just acknowledging the same harm that you are seeing. I feel like that's so real. Thank you.
Yeah, I really, really agree with that. I think that it's sometimes staff and administrators feel like they need to be a representation of for the school at all times and kind of put on their PR hat and say nothing, say that, oh, like, you know, everything is good and not pointing out the same things that we're seeing, especially when a student does come to you. Like I know for me, when I would go to administration and when I would hear things like, well, some people do like Greek life and, kind of just putting on, I don't want to say a show, but just like PR statements to save face on behalf of the university. I felt that was pretty discouraging for me, especially because I already did feel alienated by a system and did have so much shame when, like after being in it. So I would say, yeah, taking a step back from what you believe in for the students and then your public relations persona for the school. Because while you are representing the school, you're also representing the students. And yeah, that can be a fine line.
I have one more thing to add, if that's okay.
Please.
Yeah, I think like the simplest thing is my experience, and I don't know if you two agree with me, is that I didn't recognize how much I learned from being president of PSA. Like I learned event planning, I learned accounting, I learned how to speak, all these really, really important, valuable skills that are supposed to come out of college. And yet, like I'm a public policy major, and never once did we talk about the importance of activism in policy. And when I tried getting PSA to count for my experiential learning, they said it doesn't, it has to be an internship. So I think just kind of reaffirming to students like what they're learning and like the individual growth that they can get out of this. I feel like it was when I first worked for Girls Inc. I had an internship, and she said I was an expert in Title IX, and that was the first time anyone had ever told me that like I had gotten something personal out of PSA. And I wish my university and just like my random professors I had kind of supported that more.
If I can hold that all of you are experts, first off, not just because you're on this panel, but before this panel, that's part of why we asked, but acknowledging that your lived experiences and so much of, as you just mentioned, Lizzie, that you contributing yourself through these processes, in some ways trying to prove to a school that isn't even giving the affirmation, not even believing you, in some ways shaming you from these experiences, and yet acknowledging that truly you've overcome them. To use the metaphor that Lizzie used earlier about climbing the mountain, that you've already climbed the mountain. It's a matter of now looking on the other side as to what is your next steps in all of this. One of the audience questions, it's kind of a complicated question, even though it's a straightforward question. The question is, what gives you hope in your activism? Now, I named there might be no hope, or maybe there's limited hope, but I want to at least engage with each of you. What is the hope looking forward for you as an individual, or maybe for the institution? What do you see as that hopeful narrative that we can provide?
Mine is, oh, can you guys hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, cool. Mine's kind of really simple. And like, not that I need external validation, but PSA has skyrocketed. They just got quoted in the Lily. I'm seeing Diamondback articles everywhere. When I was president, like we went up 100 people. Like that was really cool, and that gave me hope that people want to do this work. They just don't know how. And the second thing that I've always told myself is, like, all you have to do is name one person that you helped. Like I know my person, love her dearly, but if there's one person that you helped, I think that everything's worth it.
Yeah, I think those little things are really what gives me hope. I come from an event planning background, so usually it's like, like once the event is done, that's what a success is for me. But once I started entering into advocacy policy, it became more of the little things. Like, we got to restart the University of Maryland Police Advisory Council. So what are the next steps for that? Continuing conversations on that. We got to have a land acknowledgement statement for C. That's a really big thing for entertainment, and like just a very little piece of everything. And so that was really fulfilling to me. And then even kind of like the biggest win probably for a lot of me and like my peers is like getting the ICE contract removed from campus. So those are the things that give me hope, like the little pushes that I can turn into something more. I may not be able to see everything follow through. I might not be able to see systematic change, but those little wins and how you claim them as accomplishments are what gives me hope.
For a while, I didn't know what the conclusion of my podcast was going to be. I mean, internally, I always knew it would be abolish Greek life, but I didn't actually know that I was going to say that at the end of my podcast, because it felt so like, oh my God, like I can't say that. Like, how would that work to abolish Greek life? And then coincidentally, the abolish Greek life movement kind of took force while my podcast was being released. And so I remember that was something that really gave me hope and gave me validation to say that message of, yes, abolish Greek life. So I think just seeing other people saying the same things as you really gives me hope. And I think even just opportunities like this, being asked to speak on this panel, gives me hope that people want to listen and that people do care, and there is hope.
Well, I will try to not be super cheesy, but genuinely you all give me hope. I know as Brian and I have thought about this conversation, just have been so energized about the work that you have done. We've seen the ripple effects even amongst faculty and staff talking about your work among all the other incredible students that we have on this campus. So genuinely, thank you. Thank you for the labor and the energy and the care. And we hope you and everyone listening continues to care for themselves while they do this. So as we kind of move to the end of our time, I do want to give each of you the opportunity, if you would like, for any closing remarks, anything else that you want to share with those listening, those in the future who might listen to this recorded, or any final thoughts.
I just want to thank you, I guess, for giving the space. It reaffirms that, like, I guess we're all doing the right thing. And the second thing is my favorite quote from my favorite. And he talks about how he doesn't like losing, but winning isn't worth.
Lizzie, can you go back?
Oh, sorry.
You cut out for a sec. Yeah, can you start at the beginning of the quote? Thank you so much.
Sorry, the Texas Public Library Wi-Fi isn't the best. But there's a quote from a book, Mountains Beyond Mountains, and Paul Farmer talks about that he likes winning, but not if it means he has to turn his back on the losers. And so he fights the long defeat, even if he won't win. And I think that's what got me through my 4 years at UMD, was just like the idea of the long defeat. And so if it helps anyone else, that's cool.
I think for me, just to any students, even faculty or any activists, it's just like, keep learning, learning from either books, learning from other people, just keep challenging yourself and growing, because ultimately, I think having power in yourself will help get things done. It'll help, kind of create this era of change or ability of change.
Yeah, I would say that you can go about things on your own terms when using your freedom of speech, and you don't always have to report. If something happens to you and that's not the route that you want to go, you still can get your message across, and you still can reclaim your power by sharing your story, even if it's with an audience, through a dance or a song or a podcast, or an essay. There's still ways that you can feel comfortable in sharing your truth while it's still being on your own terms and not having to go through the really, really difficult process that is sometimes reporting. And I think for some people it works for them, but it doesn't always work for everybody. And so I find that people sometimes think that they can't say anything if that's the only route. But I just want to say that there are different routes, and you can find your own that feels safest for you.
Grateful for each of you. For us as a group, certainly grateful for our participants, some of the great questions that you've been asking. And hopefully as we do leave this space together, beyond the additional care and support that you provide in unity with oneself, that as we are trying to attempt this to be a more global response, that connecting with each other, Nabila said earlier about the mentors and the relationships built in some of these spaces, the trauma that each of you have shared and the labor is extensive. And so how much unified amongst community members And also naming with oneself, what is it that we can do better to serve each other, to listen radically, as folks have shared throughout this time. How can we advance this beyond the performative? How can we ensure that we're using online tools? All the topics that we've talked about today are transferable to what the college experience, and frankly, beyond college for a lot of us. And so again, grateful for each of you and your time, your stories, the amount that you've put into this space. I am filled with gratitude and peace.
Thank you all so much. At this point, as we kind of close out our time, I'll go ahead and share my screen and put the resources again, just in case anything came up today that you do think you need a little bit of extra care, and we strongly encourage that. But thank you again, and thank you to our wonderful panelists today. Each of your expertise was greatly appreciated. Thank you.